There is a footprint in the mud. Not a human footprint. The edges are sharp, pressed deep into dried clay the way stone presses into stone. The kind of weight that simply arrives and leaves the ground changed forever. The kind that does not negotiate. The kind that does not pause to consider what it is standing on. Stand next to it. Look down. Your entire body fits inside it. Both feet. And still there is room. Now look at what lies beside it. A flint tool. Worn smooth from 10,000 hours of human hands. Someone's father made that. Someone's grandfather. Passed down through generations because survival required precision, required patience, required the slow, careful accumulation of skill across lifetimes. It is sitting inside the footprint. Swallowed whole. That is where we begin. Not with gods. Not with scripture. Not with the clean, comfortable language of theology. We begin with a single moment when the earth first felt the weight of something it was never designed to hold. This is the story of the firstborn hybrids. The ones who arrived before the world had a word for what they were. The ones who grew and kept growing past every boundary nature had ever drawn. Before the wars. Before the bones scattered across the valleys. Before the blood in the rivers. There was a child. And the child was hungry. Ask yourself a simple question. If the most terrifying beings in ancient religious tradition actually walked this earth, beings of supernatural origin, unprecedented scale, and ravenous appetite, why do we know almost nothing about their early years? Why does the canon go silent? The answer is not mystery. It is not accident. It is a decision. For the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, communities across the ancient Mediterranean world circulated texts that the modern church does not include in its Bible. One of the most significant was the Book of Enoch, a sprawling, visionary work that described in stark detail the descent of celestial beings called Watchers, their union with human women, and the catastrophic progeny that followed. Alongside it circulated fragments of what scholars now call the Book of Giants, preserved most notably in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in Cave 4 at Qumran, where they lay sealed in darkness for over 2,000 years. These texts were read. They were quoted. They were taken seriously. Then, slowly they were set aside. The 4th century changed everything. As the institutional church consolidated its authority and defined its canon, the apocalyptic literature that had nourished early communities began to be deprioritized. Not banned overnight. Not burned in a single dramatic moment. Simply moved to the edge. Left outside the door. And the theological framework that replaced it was elegant in its simplicity. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most formidable minds in the entire history of Western theology, addressed the question directly in his City of God, Book 15, Chapter 23. Augustine did not dismiss the ancient texts carelessly. He was too careful for that. He engaged with them. He wrestled with them. But the conclusion he reached redirected the entire conversation. The sons of God who descended to earth? In Augustine's framework and in the Sethite view that came to dominate mainstream Christianity, they were not celestial beings at all. They were men. Specifically, the godly line of Seth. The daughters of men they took as wives? Women from the corrupted line of Cain. The story became easier to preach, easier to explain, easier to control. The supernatural became moral. The cosmic became a problem of human genealogy. And the firstborn hybrids, the physical children of a union between categories of being that were never meant to merge, quietly disappeared from the official record. What remained in the canon was the flood, the judgment, the aftermath. But the years before the growth, the hunger, the slow unraveling of the natural order, those years exist only in the margins, in the fragments, in the texts that were left outside the door, in Cave 4 at Qumran, waiting. The Book of Enoch does not waste time on sentiment. Chapter 7, verse 3 states it plainly. The giants consumed all the acquisitions of men, all the labor, all the stores, all the accumulated harvest of communities that had worked their fields through heat and drought and the grinding uncertainty of ancient agriculture, until the land could no longer sustain them. 6 words that carried the weight of civilizational collapse. Consider what they mean in practice. An agricultural settlement in the ancient Near East was not a system of abundance. It was a system of precise, fragile balance. Every family calculated their grain stores against the length of winter. Every tribe tracked the water source, the soil depth, the number of mouths to feed against the number of hands to plant. One bad harvest could mean starvation. 2 consecutive failures could mean the end of a community entirely. There was no margin. Every jar of grain represented weeks of bent-back labor in the heat. Every dried fish hanging from the rafters was a morning someone rose before dawn and walked to the water in the cold and waited. Every skin of oil pressed from olives was the result of hands that knew exactly how much it would cost to replace it and exactly how long the family could survive without it. This was not wealth. This was arithmetic. Now introduce into that arithmetic an entity that does not operate by human biological rules. The ancient scribes did not record the daily conversations of the tribes who witnessed this. The fragments we possess are not narrative diaries. But the text of 1 Enoch establishes the progression with blunt clarity, and from that progression we can understand what the surrounding communities experienced, week by week, season by season. In the beginning, perhaps no one understood what was happening. A child who eats more than expected, who grows faster than expected, who requires new clothing before the old clothing is worn out, not because of carelessness, but because the body inside it has outpaced it. The fragments from Qumran reference figures named Ohia and Haya, identified as sons of the Watcher Shemihaza. These were among the firstborn, the first generation to arrive in a mortal world entirely unprepared for their existence. Imagine what it meant to grow at that rate. The coarse linen fabric that human hands wove for weeks would last days. Split at the shoulders first, that is where the stress concentrates when the frame beneath expands beyond its design tolerance. Then at the chest. then at the seams of the arms. The garment becomes a record of the body's acceleration, a series of failures, stitched over and over again by hands that could not keep pace. The food stores emptied faster than anyone had ever seen a store empty. Not because of waste. Not because of carelessness. Because of sheer, relentless biological demand. A body growing at that rate burns through caloric energy the way a fire burns through dry wood. It does not choose to. It simply does. The hunger is not cruelty. It is physics. But the communities surrounding it did not have a framework for physics of this kind. What they had was an observation carefully and quietly made, passed from one elder to another in the language of dread. The grain that should have lasted until spring is already gone. The dried fish stripped from their hooks before the first frost. The oil jar empty when it should be half full. And then the next jar. And the next. Picture a woman walking into her storehouse in the gray early morning, the way she has walked in every morning for 20 years, reaching for the clay jar in its familiar place on the shelf and finding it lighter than it should be. Far lighter. She lifts it, turns it over. A thin dust of grain falls out and disappears into the air. She stands there. She does not move for a long time. Because she knows the calculation. She has always known it. She has run it every morning since she was old enough to be trusted with the count. And standing there with the empty jar, she runs it again, and the number she arrives at is not a number a family can survive. She does not go back inside and tell them. Not yet. She walks to the next jar. That one is lighter too. The children are going to sleep hungry again tonight. Not because the harvest failed. Not because the rains did not come. Because something in the valley below operates outside the calculations that human life is built on. Because something arrived that the world had no category for and no capacity to feed. That is the particular horror embedded in 1 Enoch chapter 7. Not violence, not yet. Just appetite. Appetite operating at a scale that exceeded every human concept of enough. Moving through a community's resources the way a flood moves through a valley, not with malice, but with the complete indifference of something following its own internal logic. The Yah of the Book of Giants fragments is not described as a monster in these early passages. He is described as a youth. Enormous, yes. Alien, in proportion, yes. But a youth still learning the shape of the world, still moving through it without fully understanding the damage left in his wake. That is the detail that stays with you. Not the size. Not the strength. The fact that he was simply alive. Simply hungry. Simply growing into a world that had no place for him and no way to feed him. And the woman with the empty jar had no name for what was happening to her. She only knew the jar was empty, and that it had been full before he arrived. Stop. Before we go further, understand what you are about to hear. Whether read as history, theology, or warning, 1 Enoch chapter 7 gives us a sequence. A step-by-step picture of a world running out of life. And it follows a logic that is, once you see it, impossible to look away from. The human stores were gone. Chapter 7, verse 4. The giants turned to the animals. Birds first. The ancient sky that had been full of them, the migrations that early communities tracked as calendars, that they hunted with careful precision and celebrated as gifts, began to empty. Not because of weather, not because of disease, because something in the valley below had a hunger the remaining grain stores could no longer address. Then the wild beasts, the deer, the ibex, the creatures of the open terrain that human hunters pursued with tools and strategy and the accumulated knowledge of generations. The giants did not need tools. They did not need strategy. They needed only reach. Then the reptiles, the fish, every living thing that could be caught and consumed. The text's progression is deliberate. It is not chaos, it is sequence. First the human agricultural surplus. Then the domesticated edge of the natural world. Then the wild interior. Each stage representing a system that existed in careful, ancient equilibrium, and each system failing in turn as the demand placed upon it exceeded its capacity to recover. This is what the end of the world looks like. Not a single catastrophic event. A sequence of small failures, each one pushing the next system past its limit, each one narrowing the margin of survival for every living thing in the affected territory. The communities watching this would have understood it in the only language available to them: the animals are leaving. The fish don't come anymore. The birds stopped. They would not have had words for what was happening to the living systems around them. But they would have felt it. In their bodies. In the lightness behind their ribs. And then chapter 7, verse 5. They began to devour each other. Hold that sentence. The Book of Enoch does not elaborate with graphic detail or linger on the horror for effect. It states the progression as a matter of record. When all external food sources were exhausted, when the land, the animals, the birds, the fish had all been consumed beyond recovery, the system turned on itself. The hunger doesn't know it has eaten everything. It only knows it is still hungry. And here is what separates this account from simple mythology. The text does not frame this as moral decision. The progression in 1 Enoch chapter 7 is precisely that, a progression. Each step following the previous, with the grim, inevitable logic of a system collapsing under its own unresolvable demand. Ohia and Haya, these firstborn figures from the Qumran fragments, are described elsewhere in those same fragments as dreaming dreams of overwhelming terror in the period before the flood. Scholars who have examined the Dead Sea Scrolls note that the giants in these texts appear to experience a dawning comprehension. A moment when the scale of what has been done through them, begins to reach their awareness. But comprehension arrived too late. It always does. The valley that once supported human life with its grain fields, its herds, its careful seasonal rhythms, had become something else. A terrain emptied of sustaining life. Footprints pressed deep into mud that nothing would grow from. Ancient tree lines broken apart, not for fire or shelter, but because the hands that pulled them were too strong to stop. A silence that was not peace. That was absence. The kind of silence that settles over a place after everything that made noise is gone. We need to talk about what this actually is. Not as mythology. Not as fragments in a desert cave. As a warning, the structural kind. The kind that looks like it is about one thing while being, with uncomfortable precision, about something else entirely. The story of the firstborn Nephilim is the story of power growing faster than responsibility. Think about what the Watchers did. They introduced into the existing order something that had not evolved within it. Something not shaped by the pressures and limitations that shaped everything else in the system. The firstborn hybrids did not grow slowly. They did not develop in proportion with their environment. They did not acquire hunger and strength gradually, in a pace that allowed the surrounding world to adapt. They arrived already beyond the world's capacity to process them. And no one, not the Watchers who fathered them, not the human communities who hosted them, not whatever governing structure the ancient world possessed, had a mechanism to address what was happening before it was too late to address it. This is the specific failure the text is documenting. Not evil. Not malice. Not even conscious choice. A structural failure. The introduction of accelerating capability into an environment built for limits with no corresponding framework of accountability. No off switch. No one whose job it was to ask, what happens when this outgrows the valley? Today, our giants do not walk through ancient valleys. They run through servers and markets and decisions made faster than ordinary people can follow. They process in milliseconds what would take a human team months. They evolve their own operational patterns in ways their creators design but do not fully control. We call them by different names. We debate their implications in conference rooms and legislative chambers and on the very platforms that emerged from the same acceleration they are now used to discuss. Underneath every one of those debates is the same ancient question. When you build something that grows faster than your ability to understand it, whose appetite scales beyond what you anticipated, who is responsible for what it consumes? The Watchers did not intend the collapse of the ancient world. The text does not describe them as architects of destruction. They descended. They chose. And from that choice emerged something the world around them was unprepared for, something with an appetite that operated outside the boundaries the world was built on. Intention does not determine impact. The grain stores of the ancient communities were not emptied by malice. They were emptied by appetite. An appetite that could not choose to require less, could not choose to grow more slowly, could not choose to stop when the stores ran low, because it had not been built with the capacity for those choices. The question that every generation facing accelerating power without accountability eventually has to ask, and that most generations avoid until the answer is forced upon them, is not, can this be stopped? It is, at what point does stopping become impossible? The Watchers had a moment. Early, before the land was stripped. Before the animals were gone. Before the cascade reached its final stage, when the choice to intervene was still a choice. When the system had not yet consumed its own capacity for correction. They did not intervene. And here is what the ancient writer understood, that we have the benefit and the burden of being able to apply to our own present moment. By the time the text says the land could no longer sustain them, the moment for structural correction is already past. That sentence is not a warning. It is a record. A record of what happened after the warnings were not heeded. After the moment for intervention passed without intervention. The warning comes earlier. It comes when the garments are first tearing at the seams. When the grain jars are going empty faster than they should. It comes in the data before the crisis. In the system behavior before the failure becomes irreversible. The ancient world, encountering this for the first time, had no map. We have the map. The question is whether we are reading it, or whether we are standing in the storehouse in the gray early morning, lifting the jar, feeling how light it has become and telling ourselves something will fix this before it reaches the stage the text describes next. Nothing fixed it. Not until the flood. And by then, the valley was already silent. Many ancient flood traditions preserve some memory of a world-ending catastrophe. The Mesopotamian records, the Genesis narrative, the fragments from Qumran. Across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, the memory persists. The world that existed before the world shaped by the Watcher's descent and the firstborn generation's unchecked expansion ended. What was preserved was a remnant. What was lost was everything else. The valleys where the firstborn walked are under sediment now. Under the accumulated weight of centuries of silence. The footprints press deep into ancient clay. If they persist anywhere beneath the geological record, are buried beyond our capacity to reach them. What we have instead are the texts. The fragments. The copies of copies of copies. Passed through hands that believed they were preserving something important, something the official record had decided to set aside but that the tradition refused to release. Cave 4 at Qumran. The Book of Enoch, preserved in its complete form only in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, a tradition that never agreed to put it down. These are the inheritance. Not triumphant. Not clean. Not free from the distortions of transmission and translation and the inevitable human tendency to reshape a story as it passes through successive generations of hands. But present. Still here. Still carrying within them the shape of something the ancient world observed and tried, in the only language available to them, to pass forward. Stand in that valley now in your mind. The way it must have been in the last season before the end. The grain stores empty. The herds gone. The sky empty of birds. The river surfaces still. No catch. No movement beneath the water. Just the flat, indifferent surface of the world that has been taken down to nothing. And in the distance the sound of something still breathing. Still moving through the stripped terrain with the same indifferent momentum it has always had. The hunger that ate the world does not know the world is gone. It has no mechanism for knowing. It only knows what it has always known, that it needs more. That it has always needed more. That more is simply what it is. The humans who survived carried in the ark, preserved in the memory of flood traditions from Mesopotamia to the ancient Near East, came out into a changed world. A world that bore the scars of what had walked through it. A world whose soil remembered the weight, whose silences remembered what they had contained. They did not forget. They wrote it down in the fragments that circulated through early communities, in the texts that were set aside but not destroyed, in the caves above the Dead Sea where the scrolls survived 2,000 years of darkness and wind and the slow erosion of everything around them and still held. That is the remarkable thing. Not that the texts survived by accident, but that people kept copying them, kept carrying them, kept believing that what was written inside them was worth the cost of preservation, because they understood something that the official record, in its reorganization, quietly deprioritized. That the story of the firstborn hybrid who outgrew the earth before he learned to speak was not a story about the past. It was a story about a pattern. A pattern that does not require supernatural beings to repeat itself. That requires only the same conditions: capability accelerating beyond accountability, appetite scaling beyond the environment designed to contain it, and the moment of possible intervention passing quietly, unremarked, while the jars go empty one by one. The firstborn did not choose to be what he was. That is the thing the text never asks you to forget. The tragedy embedded in 1 Enoch chapter 7 is not the tragedy of evil choosing destruction. It is the tragedy of a system operating exactly as its nature demanded, consuming, growing, demanding in a world that had no architecture for containing it. The fault did not begin with the child. It began before the child. It began in the decision to introduce into a bounded world something unbounded. In the moment when those with the knowledge and the power to understand what they were setting in motion chose, anyway. The valley is silent now. The footprint is still in the mud. The flint tool sits inside it, worn smooth by 10,000 hours of human hands, patient and still and completely unchanged. And if you are quiet enough, if you set down everything you are carrying and simply listen, there is something in the distance, still growing. So tell me in the comments honestly, when the first hybrid outgrew the world, where did the fault truly lie? Was it the cosmic arrogance of the Watchers who descended knowing what they were and chose anyway? Or was it the blinding fear of the humans who stood at the edge of the valley, watching the jars go empty, and did nothing because there was nothing to be done? I want to know your thoughts. If you want to decode the terrifying patterns of hidden scripture and witness the birth of the ancient world's darkest chapters, subscribe. The chronicle is only getting deeper.
Enter the realm of divine secrets. Welcome to Bible Confidential.